So we've had a week to sit with Margaret Atwood's new memoir, The Book of Lives, and I gotta tell you, I find myself returning to it a lot. Returning to the ways that she framed her life, or at least the ways that she wants us to think about her life, but also thinking, now that we know all this, how does that change the way that we read Margaret Atwood? I'm Elamin Abdelmahmoud. This is Commotion. Heather O'Neill is here. Deborah Dundas is here. Hello, both of you.
Hi.
Hi. It's nice to see both of you. Deborah, I'm going to start with you, pal, because you and I have both interviewed Margaret about this new book, and I don't say this lightly, but that comes with some warnings, shall we say. Some people say, boy, you're going to talk to Margaret Atwood. Get ready for that conversation. I think she's had a reputation for being like, hey, if you can ask me a question, be precise about your questions, otherwise she's not going to necessarily, indulge. And so before we get into the book, I just want to ask you about your time with her. What surprised you about interviewing her? What surprised you about your time with her?
Well, I've interviewed her many, many, many times. So, and the first couple of times it was terrifying, and I prepared the way I would for any interview, which is writing my questions, some of them open-ended, some of them. But you don't interview Margaret Atwood like that. You know all of this stuff and you keep it there. But then the conversation is going to go the way Margaret wants it to go, I think, mostly speaking. So, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. When I spoke to her about this book, she said, well, my editors came up to me and said, okay, well, how about doing a literary memoir? And she's saying, oh, what's that going to be? I wrote a book. I wrote another book, and then I wrote another book. Like she said, it's not even like ballet, and it's interesting, right? So the idea of talking about process or the book itself, even with themes and things. So you talk to her, she'll take it in different directions, and every time I talk to her, I learn something. So I learned something new just about the world, about life, about, whatever. So what I've learned to do is shut up and listen to her. And it's always much better than what I would have gotten with my questions anyway. So it's a completely different thing. And if you ask a stupid question, you're going to hear about it. Yeah, you're going to hear about it. Yeah, she's, yeah. And I think that came when The Handmaid's Tale came out. She was doing the rounds, and all these old white guys who were doing all the interviews then. One of them asked her, okay, well, I haven't read the book. Ding, 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 right? That's
problem number one. Yeah.
I didn't read the book, so sum it up for me in 25 words or less.
Yeah.
Right? So she had a sharp retort, fair, and that's how she started getting the reputation, because, people were asking stupid questions.
Well, I don't want to scare Heather here, because Heather is about to interview Margaret in a couple of weeks in Calgary about this memoir. But I do think that it's worth noting. I found her to be an incredibly generous person on stage, incredibly giving, incredibly playful on stage. But it does have to do with the thing that you're talking about, like, hey, do all the preparation you need to do. But then after that, let the conversation sort of go where she's interested in going. And as long as that sort of as long as you begin with that approach, I think that something kind of magical can happen on stage. But that's Heather, we're not here to prepare you for that, because you've done your own preparation for this. So you're not only have you read the memoir, as you were reading the memoir, you also found yourself rereading 3 different novels of hers as you were doing this. So you're up there and you're doing your homework. Tell me about the 3 books that you returned to. Like, why were those the books that you returned to as you prepare for this?
Honestly, I think I'm going to end up reading more. I didn't actually want to be rereading Margaret Atwood's novels at this particular time. It just, as I was reading her memoir, I couldn't stop myself. And then each time I was like, oh, I have to grab this book. And I was like, Heather, you have things to do. You don't have the entire November to reread all of Margaret Atwood's oeuvres, because when she starts talking about her childhood, I didn't realize how much time she had spent in the woods, as an infant and little girl, with her father, who's a biologist. And
half the year every year, right? Yeah.
I was like, I have to reread the entire Madame trilogy, but I was like, no time. And then I was like, oh, I have to reread Cat's Eye, because she's talking about this little central trauma where she meets Cordelia in real life. But I was like, I have no time. But then I got to the part where she talks, and it's a very gossipy part of the memoir where she talks about how she met Graeme Gibson and how he was in an open marriage. And immediately I was like, oh, open marriages, because I've been listening to Lily Allen on repeat. And so, and then it was such a fascinating story. Like I sort of knew nothing about it. If I had been around in the 70s at those parties, I'm sure it was all the talk.
Yeah.
But so she enters and she begins a relationship with Graeme Gibson, who's in this open marriage, and she wants it to be something more. She wants to have a relationship. She wants him to be the love of her life. So eventually they do end up living together, but Graeme Gibson always refuses to divorce his wife. And the way Margaret Atwood in the memoir, it's very much like oftentimes in life, we make these narratives for ourselves and put them in little boxes so we can reference later. And this is she's bringing down the Sandra Gibson box where it's like, Sandra was like having more affairs than Graeme, and maybe Graeme didn't want the open relationship, and really he should have left her for me. But anyways, he refuses to divorce Sandra until Margaret gets pregnant. And then Sandra, Graeme Gibson's ex-wife, divorces him. And even after that, Graeme Gibson refuses to then marry Margaret Atwood. So what you have is, and I'm reading it, and Margaret Atwood is totally, she almost kind of villainizes his ex-wife for continuing to just wreak havoc on her life forever. And then I was like, but is that how it's so, you're describing it from so far away. And I was like, I have to go back to Life After Man, which was the novel she wrote about it at the time. And I was like, girl, let me see what you said about it in the 70s. And then I read it, and it just, interestingly, Sandra, who becomes this character Elizabeth, because everybody kind of, it's obviously based on this relationship. Elizabeth becomes the main character almost of the three, and she is
Life
written
After Men?
with, yes.
Yeah.
Like there's the three voices, but then every time you get to the Elizabeth part, it is so emotional and you just want to start crying for what Elizabeth is going through. And she writes about what she's sort of enacting on Elizabeth with so much emotion and compassion, and you just feel for her and the dynamics, and you're like, wow, this is how things happen. But that's the thing with writing a novel. When we write a novel, we look at every aspect. Otherwise, it's a terrible novel. Nonfiction, we can take a point of view and just stick to it, but that's not how fiction works.
Characters have to sort of feel lived in.
Yeah. And then I put that aside. And then, in the memoir, she starts writing The Handmaid's Tale, which made me suddenly incredibly curious, because I remembered how Offred, June, actually in the book, Margaret Atwood says we can all call her June.
Finally, yes.
Yeah. And she's like, you know what? It's so clever how everyone deduced that the name was June, that I give it to you. You may call her June. And then I was thinking about how June was an adulterer, and the adultery hangs over the novel. And then I was mentioning it to my daughter, and I was like, do you remember how June is an adulterer? And she was like, vaguely, was she? And I was like, was she? Why do you think she's a handmaid? And so I started rereading The Handmaid's Tale, but not looking at it not only in the context of, all the political things, but just in that dynamic of June, the adulterer. And then I was thinking, in that bizarre ritual in Handmaid's Tale, which, I never knew what to make of it, why she chose to have, the three of them having to have this sex together. And I was like, oh my God, like Graeme Gibson obviously triangulated Margaret Atwood and Sandra Gibson in real life. And now they're literally in a triangle. And then it's and then when the commander's wife is feeling so much grief, and there's this younger woman who's like going to be pregnant, and once she's pregnant, then that ended the marriage. So I'm saying, if you read it, just having read about this affair, it is very much in that book on the human dynamic, because June is a real character, and she's full of lust and that strange Atwoodian like reserve that she has.
Heather, what I love about this,
Yes.
first of all, like Heather's hands, for those listening on the radio, Heather's hands are flying everywhere. Like you're sort of like drawing webs as you sort of describe this. And I guess like that's what the thing I wanted to get to, right? Because like, for example, the way that she describes, Cat's Eye, and then describes this like sort of like a childhood of being bullied, a certain period of time of her life as being bullied. There's sort of like a direct link from the bullying that shows up in her real life, Margaret's real life, and the novel Cat's Eye. Deborah, like to me, I didn't do that level of extent of what Heather did in terms of being like, oh, this is showing up here, this is showing up here, this is showing up here. But did reading this memoir sort of change the way that you read any of Margaret's novels? The same way.
Well, speaking of Handmaid's Tale, I'm clearly not as brilliant as Heather is, because the thing that stuck with me was Margaret Atwood talking in her memoir about saving elastics and every little thing, every little and twist ties and things like that. And that comes from, the depression and growing up poor, and you saved everything. You didn't throw anything out just in case you needed it. And I remember from The Handmaid's Tale, and I remember clocking it the first time I read it, was the plastic bags tumbling out from under the sink, where everybody, when we still used plastic bags, where everybody had them, plastic bags tumbling everywhere. My father, he was born about the same time she was. He had like 3 drawers in his kitchen full of plastic bags because he couldn't get rid of them, but he didn't need them. So this spoke to me of how every little detail of Atwood's life becomes the details in the book. I think she spoke to someone and said, everything in my fiction is true, right? All the details are true.
Yeah.
And when she's writing her memoir, I mean, that's how she sets it up, right? So she writes the memoir not as sort of in chronological order, right? So you get her childhood, but then she does it by book. So she doesn't do a literary memoir per se, where she talks about the book. She talks about what her life is. Oh, and I happened to write this book during this time, right? And so then she draws little connections to the books. And I find that fascinating. So thinking back to different of her books, I think about those little details, in surfacing even, clearly clearly that's, really in the woods, and Old Babes in the Wood, all of these things start resonating because you start knowing the details of her life. And she uses that. I mean, and it becomes really interesting. And to me, her memoir was very much Margaret Atwood. She would start talking about one thing, then she'd go on another way and into another direction. And she's funny. Oh my gosh, she's like laugh out loud funny.
Yeah.
She had boyfriends galore, and hearing her talk about all these things. And it's like sitting in a room gossiping with her. It's the generosity of spirit that you talk about, her being on stage, and she is like that now that I know how to talk to her. She's like that in person as well. And it's fun and gossipy and a little bit of, oh my goodness, and yeah, that's great. So that's how it allows me to sort of integrate her with her work, which she does at the beginning of her book anyway, right?
Yeah.
Peggy, right? And Margaret, Peggy being the personal Margaret Atwood, and Margaret being the name people call her professionally.
I'm Elamin Abdelmahmoud, and this is Commotion. Deborah Dundas is here, Heather O'Neill is here, and we are talking about Margaret Atwood's memoir, which came out about a week ago, and the ways that it maybe changes how you read her work, how you read her novels. And Heather, the thing that you're just talking about there in terms of The Handmaid's Tale, she's sort of talked for some time about how, specifically in that book, she didn't put anything in that book that didn't happen in real life. Everything that sort of politically structures the book had already occurred somewhere on the planet. She just sort of assembled it all into a single book. But she has, for a long time, been a bit evasive about the idea that all of these books, sort of the ways that they connect to her personal life. You get a little bit more of that in the memoir. You get a little bit more sort of proximity to how, like, this novel might get a little bit tangled with some of the stuff that was happening in her real life. Tell me a little bit about how you feel about that revelation, this idea that, like, after being evasive for so long about the connections between the characters, not just in Handmaid's Tale, but just in general in her work and real life, there is this a sort of confession, if you will, of like, yes, of course, some of these things originated in my real life. For you, was that a surprise that she was willing to sort of say that, at the age of 86? She's willing to come forward and say, okay, these are the connections between the works and my real life. Or did you think she was going to be evasive about this just kind of forever?
No, not at all. I mean, it's interesting to me because then because we had the novels, we so assumed that everything that was in the novels was what Margaret Atwood was thinking. So when you have something like The Handmaid's Tale, for me, one of the things that was so, Margaret Atwood has always been connected with the way that, even through the decades, things that women like to do together, like, and their crafts. And there was decades where things like crafts were just regarded as not actual art, but she was so into quilting. She was so into embroidery. She was into astrology and fairy tales. Like, she kept that on the table, really ahead of her time. And all those movements now have really been embraced by contemporary feminism. And sort of the most interesting part of Handmaid's Tale for me is that she was talking about the whisper network and the way that women convey danger and information through little notes, passing this. And it became very important, and it became a revolutionary idea in Handmaid's Tale. And then what was interesting to me is that, but then afterwards, she has kind of come up against a conflict with fourth wave feminism, which is basically that exists on the internet. And fourth wave feminism, which, we can call it the Me Too movement, so people know exactly sort of what we're talking about. And the Me Too movement was all about, shall we take the whisper network, and now that we have social media, we will bring it public, and all young girls from anywhere can say what abuse happened to them, what they're being harassed and by men in power. And then come what may, then perhaps the men in power will be removed from their position or whatever. We will at least be able to testify in a way that people hear. And then, so one would assume Margaret Atwood would be incredibly behind that. But then in the book, in her memoir, there is 4 pages about the Stephen Galloway trial.
Stephen Galloway, UBC professor, accused of sexual misconduct. By the way, there wasn't a trial. He's denied the allegations, but he acknowledged that he had an affair with the accuser. And I think there was a UBC report that was unable to find that a sexual assault had occurred. But let me continue with your point there, Heather.
I shouldn't say a trial. I keep saying trial because she acts as though it's a trial. It was a professor. A professor was fired at UBC, and there was all sorts of rumors around it because there was a gag order. Nobody knows I still don't know what happened.
And she wrote for the Globe and Mail. I think she wrote a piece for the Globe and Mail saying he wasn't given sort of a due process. I think that's the thing you're referring to, is like that's the thing that goes against the Whisper Network. Yes.
Well, yes. And then in the book, and then she says this trial. So this trial before, stop saying trial. This this event,
a public event. Yeah.
Yeah, it was a trial by social media, one might say. She wrote in a huge file, she says, larger than any file she's had for any book of research, because obviously this was a huge moral quandary for her. Because then in her memoir, she says that before anybody you can say someone sexually assaulted you, you need to go through the legal courts and have evidence, witnesses, cross-examination, where we know as women, taking these accusations to court, to authorities, they will all be thrown out. It is all he said, she said. We cannot prove that we were sexually assaulted. We only have our word that we were sexually assaulted. So that becomes, and then and it was a huge back and forth, like a Twitter war between her and so many young feminists. And then she says the answer to that is in the Testament. So I reread the Testaments, but then in the Testaments, I was like, this is still so fourth wave feminism. And like in one part in the Testament, she said, one girl's voice is not enough. You need 6 girls. And I was like, that's me too. And then I was wondering, maybe the answer to her, the way she was so invested in this situation, goes back perhaps to Cat's Eye. Whereas in Cat's Eye, I mean, one of her central traumas was this bullying by a group of young girls. And in the memoir, and she says afterwards, she still holds the idea that young girls together fight in a different way than men, in that they are twisted and they have
darker,
ways of a darker
yeah.
way of coming at her. And I wonder if when this Twitter war happened, she did not feel like this, she was in a Cat's Eye situation again with all these young women coming up against her. And so it's all very interesting that she has this conflict with this fourth wave feminism, when it seems like, because and at one point she calls them a cult, and I was like, a cult, Margaret? Were you not supposed to be our leader? You know what I mean?
That's an interesting conflict to me. The idea of, this is somebody
fascinating.
Someone who was, given us a text like The Handmaid's Tale, that sort of talks about the power of the Whisper Network. And then for that particular moment and that particular story, she seems to sort of come up against that sentiment online. Deborah, was there anything that surprised you about the way that she kind of cast that story in the memoir?
No, there's nothing that really surprised me about it. I mean, I thought was sort of interesting to see her journey as a feminist, right? Because again, she goes from like the whole 20th century. So feminism and what that meant in the 1940s and then in the 50s and on and on. And so in the 50s, she's in a graduate seminar at Harvard with her Jim Polk, who she ends up marrying, but they're all in a graduate seminar together. And she, during break time, gets up and gets the tea and cookies, which is just, excuse me, a bit gobsmacking. You don't expect Atwood to be getting up and getting tea and cookies for a bunch of guys, because that's what's expected of her. And that came from there. She talked about sex, about how there were boyfriends coming out of the woodwork, but that's because there was no real sexual urgency, so to speak. There, nobody wanted to get pregnant, and they didn't want to get you pregnant. So there was it was a more innocent time, quote unquote, because of that. But then she said to me, panty girdles, we would wear those. And she talked to men later, and they couldn't get their hands down them. They were like a barrier. She talks about what she did. She talks about how she looked after the finances and Graeme didn't. Like all of these sort of things that women of that time, the competent generation, she calls it, just automatically did, because that's what you did. So the idea of around The Handmaid's Tale, she was about to get engaged, right? She was engaged and she was about to get married to the nice boy who had an academic career ahead of him, and he was a Heidegger expert.
Yes.
And she's just so limp. That's the word I can think of. She wasn't, but she portrayed that in the way she was doing everything society expected of her. So to me, and we've got a couple of years on, I think the fourth wave feminists who are really going on. So to me, she was and is still that sort of feminist leader, because she makes it allowable to break free of all of those constructs that we're supposed to that we're supposed to feed into, because we're good girls.
Go ahead, Heather. Sorry.
Oh, yeah, because one of the things too I found so interesting, sort of related to what Deborah was saying, was that when she went to university, all the men, what was really popular was to study mythologies, the Leonard Cohen, let us compare mythologies. And while they were doing that, but all the myths, they had a male hero at the center. And she was like, well, let me go into fairy tales. Yes. And just this insistence, every time she's surrounded by these patriarchal ideas, she's like, well, let me find what the women's path is. Let me read. And then by doing this, I mean, this was very sort of revolutionary. And also then that allowed her with so many other things to bring them into the novel. She's like bringing science fiction in the novel, and people are like, is this literary fiction or science fiction? She's like, why can't it be both? Because I know these things, and these are things that appeal to women. And I love that she's like, it's not that there are no women in myths. We have just ignored them. And she's like, she's looking for oral stories about witches. She's just looking everywhere, which is something we're all sort of collectively doing as feminists now. And she really started that like all on her own in the 70s.
And the brilliance, I think, she's studying 13th century literature. To study 13th century literature, you need to know what they're thinking and looking at and creating at the time. So she studies the myths and the fables and the tarot cards, right? And the tarot and astrology and all of these things that
right? She's been reading palms on this press tour.
All of this. Because she wanted to know what it was. So this is where you get the Peggy Margaret sort of conflation in her work, right? She she does all of this for her work, and is so knowledgeable, and can I mean, her brain's like a steel trap. I mean, something goes in there and it comes out somewhere else in a conversation somewhere. It's just astonishing how much she knows and remembers, like a true polymath. And then she's sort of delightful with it, right? Reading palms, for example, or so that's it's hard to tell sometimes where Peggy ends and Margaret begins, and it might be for her too.
Well, I was going to say, I think like that is, in fact, one of the things that you should have take away from the book is the writer is not the same as the person who's written the words. I think, and there's sometimes a healthy and helpful distinction to make in terms of like, hey, this is the work that has arrived in the world and the ways that people are engaging with it and the work that it's doing in the world. And then there is the writer. And should you be so curious about the writer, here's this book. It's going to help you sort of learn about how she got there. But also, it's very much separate from the work, and she spends a fair bit of time in that book rejecting the idea that she was some kind of prophet, rejecting the idea that she saw some sort of future that other people, couldn't see, because really what she was talking about is observation. She was sort of someone who pays close attention and says, these trends are going in this way, these trends are going in this direction, and I'm just taking them to their logical extent. And I don't just mean that about The Handmaid's Tale. Oryx and Crake, that's the same kinds of ideas also pop up there. There is something to me that's really rich about spending time with the writer, but then you got to do the other thing, which is like lift your head up from their life, and then return to the work and go, okay, I see this differently now, but also what are the new things I maybe get out of it? There's a line towards the end of the book, and the line is, art is long, life is fleeting, the shadows lengthen. It's hard to shake the feeling I'm living in the half-life of a partial eclipse. This is a long book about a long and also extraordinary life. Of all the details, of all the lines, maybe each of you can give me a line or a detail that you're still thinking about. Heather, I'll start with you.
For me, it really stuck with me, the image of her as a little girl. Like there was one point when she's just following, she's in the woods and her father just gives her and her brother, her assistants. And then when she describes that she was short-sighted and needed glasses, and I was like, oh, that's so like the Margaret Atwood protagonist who's always observing us all as specimens, who's slightly removed, like she doesn't ever quite understand humans. And that has this delightful, that's where the humor comes, because her characters are always they're always like unreliable narrators. You don't know quite if what they're telling us is right, but she's observing and she puts in all the details. And then just visualizing her as that little curly-haired girl with the glasses looking at a snail with a magnifying glass. And I was like, oh, she's going to use that magnifying glass and to come and look at us. And it was just a beautiful sentiment.
Deb, what about you, pal? What's sticking out for you?
There was a time when she, I think, didn't have the money to complete Harvard. I'm trying to remember the detail, but she came back to Toronto. She needed a job.
Yeah.
And she got a job at a market research company. And she was there with her skirt and her jacket and her pearls, and doing the 1950s young career girl thing. And she was smart. And the person who was running the department allowed her to be smart, right? You couldn't hold her down. So no matter what constraints she had, and she felt that she had to follow just because that's what you had to do. And she didn't. And that to me says a lot about her and her writing, right? She, as Heather was saying, novels are certain things, but that doesn't mean you can't bring science fiction into it, do it like this, do it like that, bring mythology into it. She mentioned Robert Graves's The Greek Myths so many times in the book. And it's funny because I've got those exact 2 volumes on my bookshelves, because earlier in my life and career, I wanted to know about the myths for the same reason. If you're going to be well read and you're going to understand people who are well read and writers who are well read, you want to be able to get the in jokes, right? And the in jokes come from knowing things like the myths, knowing the Bible, knowing these sorts of things that, the classical education things that make their way into these books and make them a little bit richer, right? Because you get the in jokes. So those are the things that really struck me out of this book.
To that end, the detail that sticks with me the most is like, Margaret, I think you get a scene of Margaret in grade 4, and she's insisting on going to Sunday school, and her parents are like, we're not really sure you should go to Sunday school. But she's like, I got to find out more about this Jesus fellow. And also the Easter Bunny maybe comes from this place. And there is this, it's sort of like this perfect like distillation of there's a curiosity there that you really can't hold back in any kind of way. Even if it means your parents are going, I don't know if you should be going to Sunday school. And she's like, no, I'm going to do it. I want to do it. And to their credit, they let her do it. Heather, you were going to say something. Last word to you, pal.
One of the things, I mean, I had this absurd expectation that made no sense whatsoever that I might appear in this memoir in
Oh, that
any
would have been
little
delightful.
strange little detail. And I was like, Heather, you're not going to be in the memoir, but it feels like I spent so much of my life with Margaret Atwood. And then I feel so many people, and that's why sometimes we get so aggressive with her or angry, because we think that we know her. And then when she got to the very end, like you were saying, then all of a sudden she was like, okay, readers. And I was like, oh, I'm in the book. She's talking to us all.
That's right.
And she's like, I'm going to have to let you go eventually. I'm not going to be here forever. And it felt like someone, you know, when you have an older relative who says that and you're like, no, don't say that. No, you're never going to go away. It's never going to end, Margaret.
Oh.
And it was so touching how she said, you know, you guys have been with me through this and I don't exist without the readers. And all this back and forth we have has really been a remarkable experience. So thank you guys.
I think that's a lovely place to leave it. I appreciate your time, both of you. Thank you so much for coming on the show today, you guys. This has been lovely.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, thank you. Heather O'Neill is an author who's going to be interviewing Margaret Atwood in Calgary on December 10th. Deborah Dundas, opinion editor with the Toronto Star. You can find her conversation with Margaret Atwood online at the Toronto Star website. In the meantime, that is it for the show today. My name is Elamin Abdelmahmoud. This show is called Commotion. We'll see you tomorrow.